Title: The Echoes of Red Hollow. Jake and Sarah were seasoned hikers, always on the lookout for their next thrilling adventure. They'd explored countless trails, summited numerous peaks, and faced their fair share of challenges, but nothing had prepared them for Red Hollow. Red Hollow was an old, forgotten trail nestled deep within the Blue Ridge Mountains. The trail had long been abandoned, with only whispers and rumors hinting at its existence. According to the locals, the trail had been closed off decades ago after a series of mysterious disappearances. Most dismissed these tales as mere folklore, but the mystery was exactly what drew Jake and Sarah to it. The entrance to Red Hollow was hidden beneath a thick canopy of trees, almost as if the forest itself was trying to protect it from wandering eyes. A rusty old sign, barely visible through the overgrowth, read, "Red Hollow Trail Closed." Ignoring the warning, Jake and Sarah ventured in. The trail was narrow, winding through the dense forest. The trees loomed tall and close, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers. The air was heavy, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. There was an eerie stillness to the forest, the kind that made every crack of a twig underfoot seem deafening. As they hiked deeper into Red Hollow, they noticed something strange. The usual sounds of the forest, birds chirping, leaves rustling in the wind, were absent. It was as if the entire area had been swallowed by an unnatural silence. Even their own voices seemed muted, as though the trees were absorbing every sound. After a couple of hours, they reached a small clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated cabin. It looked out of place, as if it had been forgotten by time. The wooden walls were weathered and covered in moss, the windows cracked and clouded with dirt. A sense of unease washed over them, but their curiosity was stronger. "Should we check it out?" Jake asked, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. "Yeah, why not? It might have some history," Sarah replied, trying to sound confident. The cabin door creaked loudly as Jake pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale and thick with dust. The interior was sparse, a single wooden table, a couple of chairs, and a fireplace filled with ash. But what caught their attention was the strange carvings on the walls. They were symbols, jagged and crude, spiraling in patterns that made their heads spin if they looked too long. "Creepy," Sarah muttered, running her fingers over one of the carvings. Jake shone his flashlight around the room, the beam catching something in the corner. A small, leather-bound journal lay on the floor, half buried under debris. He picked it up and carefully opened it. The pages were brittle and yellowed with age, the handwriting spidery and uneven. The journal belonged to a man named Robert Finch, dated back to the early 1900s. As Jake and Sarah skimmed through the pages, a chilling story began to unfold. Robert was a hiker like them, who had stumbled upon Red Hollow during one of his expeditions. He wrote about how the trail seemed to change as he walked, the trees shifting, the path bending in ways that defied logic. He described a feeling of being watched, followed by whispers that grew louder the deeper he went. Then the entries became erratic. Robert wrote about hearing his own voice calling out to him from the woods, seeing shadows that danced just out of sight, and encountering the same carvings on the trees as in the cabin. His last entry was the most disturbing. "I don't know how long I've been here. Time doesn't work right in Red Hollow. The whispers are louder now, and they speak in my voice. They want me to stay. They want more." A cold shiver ran down Sarah's spine. "We need to get out of here, Jake." Jake nodded, stuffing the journal into his backpack. But as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a force that sent dust swirling into the air. The temperature dropped suddenly, their breath visible in the chill. The carvings on the walls seemed to writhe, the symbols glowing faintly. Then they heard it. A voice, distant at first but growing louder, echoing through the cabin. It was Sarah's voice. "Jake, over here." Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he spun around, trying to find the source. But Sarah was right beside him, equally terrified. "Jake, come closer," the voice called again, this time from outside the cabin. "What the hell is happening?" Sarah whispered, clutching Jake's arm. Before he could respond, the cabin's walls began to creak and groan, as if something was pressing in on them. The air grew heavier, suffocating. The voice called out again, and this time it was Jake's. "Sarah, follow me." Without warning, the door burst open, revealing the dark forest outside. The voices, now both of theirs, were coming from the woods, beckoning them deeper into Red Hollow. Panic set in and they bolted out of the cabin, running blindly down the trail. But no matter how far they ran, the voices followed, growing louder, closer, until it felt like they were right behind them. Finally, they stopped, gasping for breath. The trail had changed. It was no longer the narrow path they had followed earlier. The trees were different, twisted and gnarled, their branches like claws reaching out to them. Then they saw it. A figure standing in the distance, shrouded in shadow. It was barely visible through the thick fog that had rolled in, but they could make out its shape. It was tall, with limbs that seemed too long, too thin. As it moved closer, they realized with growing horror that the figure was mimicking their movements. Jake raised his hand, and the figure did the same. Sarah took a step back, and it mirrored her exactly. Their own reflections, distorted and wrong. They turned to run again, but the forest seemed to close in around them. The trees formed a barrier, trapping them in a narrow corridor with no way out. The voices became a deafening chorus, each one an exact replica of their own. Desperation took hold, and they plunged deeper into the woods, ignoring the burning in their lungs and the aching in their legs. But no matter how far they ran, they couldn't escape the voices, the figure, or the labyrinthine trail. Finally, they stumbled upon a clearing, only to find themselves back at the cabin. The door stood open, waiting for them. The figure was gone, but the whispers remained, now coming from the journal that lay open on the ground. Sarah picked it up, her hands trembling. The pages were blank, except for one line written in fresh ink. "Welcome back. We've been waiting." Jake felt a chill run down his spine as he noticed something new. The carvings on the cabin walls were now on their skin, the symbols etched into their flesh, pulsing with a life of their own. The trail had taken them, just as it had taken Robert Finch and so many before them. Red Hollow was no ordinary place. It was a trap, a living entity that fed on those who dared to enter. As the sun began to set, Jake and Sarah realized the horrifying truth. They were no longer hikers lost in the woods. They were now a part of Red Hollow, echoes in the endless loop of the trail, forever calling out to the next adventurers who would dare to enter. And in the distance, the forest whispered their names. The Lantern Man. The town of Maplewood had its share of ghost stories, but none were as infamous as the tale of the Lantern Man. A lonely figure, they said, who wandered the woods with a flickering lantern, searching for something or someone who was lost. Some claimed he was the spirit of a miner who had died in a cave-in long ago. Others believed he was a grieving father, forever looking for his missing child. But whatever the truth, one thing was certain: those who saw the Lantern Man were never the same afterward. It was a chilly October afternoon when Eric and his friends decided to explore the Maplewood forest. They were on break from college, back in their hometown for the long weekend, and looking for something to do. The forest was vast and dense, crisscrossed with trails both well-worn and forgotten. They'd hiked there many times before, but today they were in search of something different. The old mining trail, rumored to be the Lantern Man's haunt. "Do you really think we'll see him?" asked Jenny, her voice tinged with both excitement and apprehension. "Who knows?" Eric replied with a grin. "It's just a story, right? But hey, if we do, at least we'll have a cool story to tell." The group consisted of Eric, Jenny, Mike, and Lisa, friends since high school and inseparable ever since. They had a bond forged over years of shared experiences, from late-night study sessions to summer road trips, but nothing they'd done before had prepared them for what lay ahead. The trail started off easy enough, wide and clear with the sun filtering through the canopy of autumn leaves. They laughed and joked as they walked, the crunch of leaves underfoot a comforting sound. But as they ventured deeper into the forest, the path began to narrow. The trees grew closer together, their branches forming a tangled web above. The light dimmed and the air grew colder. "Are we sure we're going the right way?" Mike asked, glancing around. "According to the map, we should be close," Eric replied, though his confidence was waning. The map was old, a photocopy of a photocopy, and the markings were faded and hard to read. Still, he pressed on, leading the way. After another hour of walking, they came upon a fork in the trail. One path led downhill, where the trees thinned out and the ground was rocky and uneven. The other continued straight, disappearing into a dark thicket. "Which way?" Lisa asked, her voice tight. Eric hesitated, then pointed to the downhill path. This way. The map says the old mine should be in this direction. As they descended, the atmosphere grew heavier, almost oppressive. The wind had died down, and the forest was eerily silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of their own footsteps echoing in the stillness. "I don't like this," Jenny whispered, clutching her arms for warmth. "Relax," Eric said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We'll check out the mine and head back. It's probably just an old cave, nothing to worry about." But as they rounded a bend, they saw it, an old, crumbling structure, half hidden by overgrown bushes and ivy. It was the entrance to the mine, just as they'd been told, a dark, yawning mouth in the side of a hill. A shiver ran down Eric's spine, but he shook it off. "Here it is," he said, forcing a smile. "The Lantern Man's home." They stood there for a moment, staring at the mine entrance. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic like rusted iron. "Are we really going in?" Lisa asked, her voice barely a whisper. Eric was about to answer when something caught his eye. In the distance, through the trees, a faint light flickered. It was small and dim, bobbing up and down as if carried by someone walking. "Do you see that?" Mike asked, his voice shaky. "The Lantern Man," Jenny breathed, her eyes wide. For a moment, they all just stood there, frozen in place. Then, without a word, Eric started walking toward the light. The others followed, as if drawn by some unseen force. The light grew brighter as they approached, but it never seemed to get any closer. It led them deeper into the woods, away from the mine and the trail. "What are we doing?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling. "We should go back." But none of them turned around. The light was mesmerizing, pulling them in like moths to a flame. It wasn't until they reached a small clearing that they finally stopped. The light was just ahead, hovering at the edge of the trees. "That's close enough," Eric said, his voice unnaturally loud in the stillness. He took a step forward, but the light moved back, retreating further into the darkness. "Don't," Jenny warned, grabbing his arm. "It's trying to lead us away. We need to go back." But before they could move, the light suddenly vanished, plunging them into complete darkness. Panic set in as they realized they couldn't see the trail anymore. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees pressing in from all sides. "Where did it go?" Mike asked, his voice rising in fear. "I don't know," Eric replied, his heart pounding. "Just stay close. We'll find our way back." But as they turned to leave, they heard something, a faint rustling in the bushes, followed by the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, getting closer. "Who's there?" Lisa called out, her voice shaking. There was no answer, only the sound of the footsteps growing louder, closer. And then, just at the edge of their vision, they saw it. The faint outline of a figure, holding a lantern. The Lantern Man. He stood there, motionless, the light from his lantern casting eerie shadows on the trees. His face was obscured by darkness, but they could feel his gaze, cold and unblinking, fixed on them. For a moment, no one moved. Then the Lantern Man took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. The light from his lantern flickered, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to dance on the trees. "Run," Eric whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. They turned and bolted, crashing through the underbrush in a blind panic. The forest seemed to shift around them, the trees twisting and turning as if alive. No matter how fast they ran, the footsteps followed, always just behind them. Finally, they burst out onto a trail, but it wasn't the one they had taken. It was different, older, overgrown, with no sign of the path they had walked earlier. "Where are we?" Jenny gasped, her breath coming in ragged sobs. "I don't know," Eric replied, his mind racing, "but we need to keep moving." They continued down the trail, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The Lantern Man was gone, but the fear lingered, gnawing at their insides. They walked for what felt like hours, the forest never changing, the trail never ending, and then, just as they were about to give up hope, they saw it. The old mine entrance, exactly where they had started. How is this possible?" Mike stammered, his face pale. But before anyone could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind them, followed by the flickering light of a lantern. "No," Jenny whispered, her voice trembling. "No, this can't be happening." But it was. The Lantern Man was back, and this time he was closer. The light from his lantern illuminated his face, revealing hollow eyes and a twisted grin. In a panic, they ran toward the mine entrance, their only thought to find shelter, to escape the relentless pursuit. They plunged into the darkness of the mine, the cold air biting at their skin. But as they descended deeper into the earth, they realized their mistake. The tunnel twisted and turned, narrowing with every step. The walls seemed to close in on them, the air growing thick and suffocating. And then they saw it. The end of the tunnel. A dead end. "We're trapped," Lisa sobbed, collapsing against the wall. Eric turned, shining his flashlight back the way they had come. The light flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. And then, in the distance, he saw it, the faint glow of the lantern, growing brighter as the lantern man approached. "We have to fight," Mike said, his voice shaking. "We can't just wait here to die." But as they prepared to face their fate, something strange happened. The walls of the tunnel began to pulse, the rock shifting and changing as if alive. The air grew thick with the smell of earth and decay, and the sound of grinding stone filled their ears. And then, with a sickening lurch, the tunnel collapsed, plunging them into darkness. When Eric opened his eyes, he was lying on the forest floor, the cold air stinging his skin. He looked around, disoriented, his heart pounding in his chest. The mine was gone, as were his friends. "Jenny? Mike? Lisa?" he called out, his voice echoing in the silence. But there was no answer. He was alone. He struggled to his feet, his legs trembling. The forest was silent and still, as if nothing had happened. But as he turned to leave, he saw it, a faint light flickering through the trees. The Lantern Man. He was, title The Lantern's Glow. Tom and Emily had always been outdoor enthusiasts, finding solace in the tranquility of nature. When they stumbled across a local legend about the abandoned lantern trail, they were intrigued. The tale spoke of a forgotten path that led to a secluded Eerie glade, where strange occurrences had been reported. The lantern trail was notorious for its unsettling atmosphere. According to the legend, the trail had been used by settlers as a shortcut through the woods, but it was abandoned after a series of unexplained disappearances. Those who dared to venture onto the path spoke of strange lights and ghostly apparitions. Of course, Tom and Emily dismissed these stories as mere superstition. On a crisp autumn evening, they decided to test the legend themselves. They set out just before dusk, armed with their gear and a sense of adventure. The trailhead was marked by an old wooden sign, barely legible through the overgrown vines. The forest was dense, with twisted trees casting long shadows. The air grew colder as the sun dipped below the horizon, and an eerie stillness settled over the woods. Emily felt a shiver, but Tom brushed it off as the chill of the evening. They hiked for hours, following the winding trail. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees pressing together as if to obscure their path. The only sound was the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. Suddenly they noticed a faint glow ahead. It was a soft, flickering light that seemed to hover in the distance. Emily's curiosity got the better of her, and she urged Tom to investigate. Reluctantly, he agreed, and they made their way toward the light. As they approached, the glow grew brighter, revealing a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was an old lantern hanging from a post, its flame dancing in the breeze. The lantern was old-fashioned, with intricate metalwork and a glass pane that glowed with an eerie, almost otherworldly light. "This is it," Tom said, his voice tinged with excitement. "The lantern from the legend." Emily was hesitant. "Something doesn't feel right about this. Maybe we should go back." But Tom was already reaching for the lantern. He carefully lifted it from the post, examining it closely. The flame inside was steady, and the lantern was surprisingly warm to the touch. As Tom turned the lantern over in his hands, Emily noticed something strange. The glow from the lantern seemed to pulse, and shadows danced erratically on the ground. The clearing felt alive, the trees pressing closer as if they were watching them. Without warning, the light from the lantern flickered violently. Tom and Emily exchanged worried glances as the forest around them seemed to darken. The lantern's glow intensified, casting long, ominous shadows. "Tom, we need to leave," Emily said urgently. "This isn't right." Tom agreed, but as they turned to head back, they realized that the path they had followed had disappeared. The forest was now a maze of twisted trees and tangled underbrush. The lantern's light seemed to create a wall of darkness around them. They tried to retrace their steps, but the woods were disorienting. The lantern's glow was their only guide, but it seemed to lead them in circles. The shadows grew longer, and the air became heavy with a sense of foreboding. As they wandered, they began to hear whispers, soft, ghostly voices that seemed to come from all directions. The voices spoke in a language they couldn't understand, their tone both mournful and threatening. Emily's heart raced as she felt a presence behind them, a shadow that seemed to follow their every move. She turned, but there was nothing there. The forest seemed to close in on them, the trees reaching out with gnarled branches. Tom was growing increasingly anxious. "We need to find a way out. Let's keep moving." They pushed through the darkness, guided by the lantern's uncertain light. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they seemed to be all around them. The voices called out, echoing with a chilling urgency. Suddenly they stumbled upon another clearing. This one was different from the first. It was larger, with an ominous, ancient stone altar in the center. The altar was covered in strange symbols, and the ground around it was littered with old, faded lanterns. Tom set the lantern down on the altar, and as he did, the flame flickered out. The clearing was instantly plunged into darkness. Panic set in as the whispers became a cacophony of voices, rising to a deafening roar. In the pitch-black darkness, Tom and Emily could barely see each other. The lantern's glow had vanished, and the whispers seemed to grow louder, more demanding. They felt as if they were being pulled toward the altar, the voices urging them to stay. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. There was an eerie silence, and then a single, clear voice spoke. "You have disturbed the resting place." A cold wind swept through the clearing, extinguishing the remaining light. Tom and Emily were enveloped in darkness, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Then the lantern's flame flickered back to life, casting a dim, eerie glow. They were surrounded by spectral figures, ghostly apparitions of people long lost to the forest. Their eyes were hollow, their expressions filled with sorrow. The figures began to move, their motions slow and deliberate. They reached out toward Tom and Emily, their hands like wisps of smoke. The couple felt a profound sadness, a sense of having trespassed into a realm they could not understand. The figures spoke in unison. "You must return the lantern. It binds us to this place. Only then can you leave." Tom and Emily, filled with dread, picked up the lantern and placed it back on the post where they had found it. As they did, the spectral figures began to fade, their whispers growing softer until they were gone. The forest seemed to breathe a sigh of relief as the darkness lifted. The path reappeared, leading them back to the trailhead. Exhausted and shaken, they stumbled out of the woods as the first light of dawn broke through the trees. Tom and Emily never spoke of their experience again. The lantern trail was left to its secrets, and the lantern remained in its clearing, a beacon for those who would come after them. The forest had claimed its share of stories, and the echoes of the lantern's glow continued to linger, a haunting reminder of the mysteries that lay hidden in the dark corners of the world. Spectre of Shiloh Ridge. Lena and Mark were avid explorers, always eager for a new adventure. When they heard about Shiloh Ridge, a remote area known for its stunning views and haunting history, they were intrigued. The stories spoke of a ghostly presence that haunted the ridge, a remnant of a tragic event from over a century ago. Shiloh Ridge was notorious for its beauty and the eeriness that surrounded it. Legend had it that during the late 1800s, a group of settlers had disappeared without a trace. Some said they had been victims of a land dispute, while others believed the ridge was cursed. Despite the tales, Lena and Mark were determined to experience it for themselves. On a crisp autumn morning, they set out for Shiloh Ridge. The trailhead was unmarked and obscured by dense foliage. They followed a barely visible path, winding through the forest until they emerged onto a rocky incline. The view from the top was breathtaking, an expansive panorama of rolling hills and dense woods. As they settled down for a break, Mark noticed something unusual, a weathered old sign partially buried under a pile of leaves. The faded inscription read, "Beware the shadows of Shiloh." Lena laughed it off, thinking it was part of the trail's lore designed to add to its mystique. They explored the ridge, taking in the view and snapping photos. As the sun began to set, the light cast long shadows across the landscape. The forest below seemed to darken, and a cold breeze picked up, causing the trees to rustle ominously. Just as they were about to head back, Lena heard a faint whisper on the wind. She stopped and listened, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. Mark shrugged it off, suggesting it was just the wind playing tricks. They made their way down the trail, but as night fell, the path became increasingly difficult to follow. The shadows seemed to shift and lengthen, creating a disorienting effect. Lena and Mark used their flashlights, but the beams seemed weak against the encroaching darkness. Then they heard it, a distant, mournful wail that seemed to come from all around them. Lena's heart raced as she looked at Mark, who was equally unsettled. The wail grew louder, echoing through the trees. It was a sound of deep sorrow and desperation. They quickened their pace, trying to make sense of their surroundings. The shadows seemed to coalesce, forming vague shapes that flickered just out of the reach of their flashlights. Lena felt a chill run down her spine. "Mark, we need to find a way out of here," Lena said, her voice trembling. "I know. Let's stick together," Mark replied, gripping his flashlight tighter. The wailing intensified, and then they saw it, a figure standing in the distance. It was a translucent silhouette, its form barely distinguishable against the dark backdrop of the forest. The figure appeared to be moving toward them, its features obscured by the gloom. "Who's there?" Mark called out, his voice wavering. The figure stopped and seemed to hover, its shape shifting and swirling. The wail grew louder, now clearly coming from the apparition. Lena and Mark felt a wave of sadness wash over them, an overwhelming sense of loss. "We need to move," Lena urged, pulling Mark along. They stumbled through the darkness, their path illuminated only by the sporadic light of their flashlights. The wailing grew more insistent, almost as if the figure was pleading with them. As they navigated the treacherous terrain, they came across an old, abandoned cabin. It was partially collapsed with broken windows and a sagging roof. The wailing seemed to emanate from inside. Against their better judgment, they decided to investigate. They pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and decay. The interior was empty, except for a dusty old journal lying on a wooden table. Mark picked up the journal and opened it. The pages were filled with frantic, scrawled writing. The entries spoke of a family who had once lived in the cabin, describing their growing fear of an unseen menace. The final entry was particularly chilling. "The shadows are coming for us. We can't escape. They want us to stay." As Mark read the entry aloud, the wailing outside grew louder. The shadows in the cabin seemed to deepen, coalescing into darker shapes. Lena's flashlight flickered and died, plunging them into near-total darkness. A cold, clammy hand brushed against Lena's arm. She gasped and turned, but there was nothing there. The wailing reached a crescendo, and then, in a sudden burst of cold air, the shadows seemed to coalesce into a figure standing in the doorway. The figure was clearer now, a woman with hollow eyes and an expression of profound sadness. She reached out toward them, her hand seeming to grasp for something beyond their reach. "We have to go," Mark shouted, pulling Lena toward the door. They fled from the cabin, the wailing and shadows pursuing them. The trail seemed to twist and turn, and the shadows followed every step. Just when they thought they were lost forever, they emerged onto a familiar path leading back to the trailhead. As they stumbled back into the open, the wailing ceased. The forest was quiet once more, the oppressive darkness lifting. They looked back, but the cabin was no longer visible, as if it had never existed. Lena and Mark returned to their car, shaken but relieved. They had experienced something inexplicable, something that defied their understanding. They had ventured into the heart of Shiloh Ridge and faced the specter of its tragic past. They never returned to Shiloh Ridge, and the experience remained a haunting memory, a reminder of the shadows that linger in the corners of the world, waiting for those who dare to uncover their secrets. Title: The Haunting of Raven's Hollow. Claire and Dan had always shared a love for the macabre. Their weekends were often spent exploring abandoned places, seeking out haunted locations and eerie legends. When they heard about Raven's Hollow, a forsaken valley known its chilling history and ghostly tales, they were immediately intrigued. Raven's Hollow was rumored to be cursed, a place where shadows moved of their own accord and where the echoes of the past lingered in the air. Legend had it that an entire village had vanished from the hollow one night, their disappearance shrouded in mystery and suspicion. The valley was said to be haunted by the spirits of the lost villagers, and few dared to venture there after dark. Determined to uncover the truth, Claire and Dan set out on a crisp autumn morning. The valley was nestled deep within a dense forest, and finding the trailhead was a challenge. When they finally located it, the overgrown path seemed to beckon them into the darkness. The hike was quiet and eerie, with the only sounds being their footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. The trees were gnarled and twisted, their branches forming an almost impenetrable canopy above. The air was thick with fog, and the temperature dropped as they descended into the hollow. After a couple of hours, they reached a small clearing. In the center stood the remains of an old stone church, its walls crumbling and covered in ivy. The church was a poignant reminder of the village that once stood here. The atmosphere was heavy with a sense of melancholy. Dan approached the church cautiously, his flashlight sweeping over the broken windows and the overgrown graveyard surrounding it. Claire noticed something unusual, an old iron gate partially hidden in the underbrush. It led to what looked like an old cemetery. "I think we should check that out," Claire suggested, her curiosity piqued. Dan agreed, and they pushed through the gate, which creaked loudly. The cemetery was overgrown, with ancient tombstones leaning at odd angles. The names on the gravestones were worn and difficult to read, but the dates were all from the late 1800s. As they wandered through the cemetery, Claire noticed a single intact gravestone near the church's entrance. The name was barely legible, but the inscription read, "Mary Ellen Ravenscroft, 1843 to 1890. A sudden chill swept through the cemetery, and Claire felt a shiver. She glanced at Dan, who seemed equally unsettled. The fog had thickened, and the shadows cast by the gravestones seemed to move of their own accord. "I have a bad feeling about this place," Dan said, his voice low. Before Claire could respond, they heard a distant, mournful wail, a sound that seemed to echo from the depths of the valley. The wail grew louder, more insistent, and seemed to surround them. The temperature dropped sharply, and the fog became even thicker. Suddenly, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The gravestones shifted, and the fog swirled around them, forming shapes that seemed to flicker and waver. The wailing turned into a cacophony of voices, each one a whisper of despair and longing. Claire and Dan hurried back to the church, but the fog was so thick they could barely see. The church's entrance appeared to be shifting, as if the building itself was moving. As they reached the church, Claire noticed a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. The figure was draped in tattered clothing, its face obscured by darkness. The figure raised a hand, pointing toward the church's interior. "Come inside," the figure's voice was a whisper carried on the wind. "We've been waiting." Despite their fear, Claire and Dan felt compelled to follow. They stepped inside the church, the air growing colder with each step. The interior was dark and musty, with broken pews and a shattered altar. The wailing was now a constant background noise, and the shadows in the church seemed to move and shift. In the dim light of their flashlights, they saw something that made their blood run cold. The walls of the church were covered in strange, cryptic symbols, painted in what looked like old blood. The symbols seemed to form a pattern, creating an ominous design that pulsed with a faint, eerie glow. Suddenly, the door behind them slammed shut with a deafening bang. The wailing grew louder, and the shadows seemed to coalesce into figures. The figures were faint but discernible, ghostly apparitions of the villagers who had vanished. They moved slowly, their expressions vacant and mournful. One of the figures stepped forward, a woman with hollow eyes and a sorrowful expression. She raised her hand, pointing toward the altar. "The key," she whispered, her voice a mournful echo. "Find the key." Claire and Dan, though terrified, approached the altar. They searched desperately, but the altar was bare except for a single ancient book. Dan picked up the book and opened it, revealing pages filled with more cryptic symbols and writings. As he flipped through the pages, a hidden compartment in the altar sprang open, revealing a rusty old key. The key was adorned with strange markings that matched those on the walls. The moment Dan took the key, the wailing ceased abruptly. The figures began to fade, their forms dissolving into the shadows. The fog lifted and the air grew warmer. Claire and Dan, still shaken, made their way back to the church entrance. The door creaked open, revealing the now clear path leading out of the valley. They hurried back through the forest, their hearts pounding. As they reached the trailhead and the safety of the daylight, they looked back at Raven's Hollow. The fog had dissipated and the church and cemetery were no longer visible, as if they had never existed. Claire and Dan never spoke of their experience again. The key remained hidden in their belongings, a silent reminder of the night they faced the haunting of Raven's Hollow. The valley's mystery remained unsolved, a chilling enigma that lingered in the dark corners of their memories.